There's a moment when you realize the loudest person in the room isn't the most powerful one. It hits you like cold water. You've been watching someone who never raises their voice, never argues, never defends themselves, yet somehow everyone orbits around their opinion. They don't demand attention. They command it. They don't fight for respect. It flows to them like gravity. And you start to wonder, what do they know that you don't? Niccolo Machiavelli understood this centuries before psychology became a science. While others were writing about honor and virtue, he was dissecting the mechanics of influence, not the kind that comes from speeches or threats, but the invisible kind, the type that works in silence, in stillness, in the space between words. Because here's what most people never realize. True persuasion doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue. It doesn't beg. It simply is. You've been taught that influence requires charisma, that power demands volume, that respect comes through force or charm. But Machiavelli would tell you, that's the amateur's game. The real professionals, they operate in shadows. They plant seeds in minds without fingerprints. They shift entire conversations without speaking. They win arguments that were never declared. And by the time you notice their influence, it's already too late to resist it. This isn't about manipulation for selfish gain. This is about understanding the architecture of human psychology. Because whether you realize it or not, you're being influenced every single day by people who understand these principles. Your boss who gets you to work overtime without asking. The friend who somehow always gets the group to choose their restaurant. The colleague who never seems to argue but always gets their way. They're using Machiavelli's invisible weapon, and you don't even know you're being moved. But what if you could see the strings? What if you could understand the subtle mechanics that make some people irresistibly influential while others remain invisible? What if you could learn to move through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly how human nature works? Today, I'm going to show you Machiavelli's most dangerous insights about silent persuasion. Not the quotes everyone knows, but the psychological principles he understood about how minds really work. How to plant ideas that feel like discoveries. How to create agreement without asking for it. How to become the person others naturally defer to, not because they have to, but because something inside them wants to. We're going to explore 3 levels of influence that most people never even recognize exist. The first level is what everyone sees. The obvious attempts at persuasion, the sales pitches, the debates, the emotional appeals. This is where amateurs play. It's loud, it's transparent, and it's easily resisted because people know they're being targeted. The second level is where most skilled persuaders operate. They understand timing. They read body language. They know how to frame conversations. They're good at what they do, but they're still playing a visible game. People can sense the strategy even if they can't name it. But the third level, this is where Machiavelli lived. This is influence that operates below conscious awareness. It doesn't feel like persuasion at all. It feels like natural conclusion, like inevitable outcome, like things simply falling into place the way they were always meant to. This is the invisible weapon, and once you understand how it works, you'll see it everywhere. The foundation of silent persuasion isn't in what you say. It's in what you don't say. It's in the silences you create, the assumptions you allow others to make, the conclusions they reach that feel like their own discoveries. Because the human mind has a peculiar trait. It trusts its own conclusions more than anyone else's arguments. So the master persuader doesn't argue. They guide. They don't convince. They reveal. Think about the last time someone changed your mind about something important. I guarantee it wasn't because they overwhelmed you with facts or emotional appeals. It was because they helped you see something you hadn't noticed before. They asked the right question at the right moment. They created a pause that let your own thoughts crystallize. They made space for your mind to work, and then They let you take credit for the insight. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote about the fox and the lion. The lion uses force. Everyone sees the lion coming. But the fox operates in subtlety. It avoids traps not by breaking them, but by recognizing them before they close. It influences not through strength, but through understanding the terrain better than anyone else. Most people approach influence like they're trying to break down a door. They push harder when they meet resistance. They raise their voice when they're not being heard. They pile on more evidence when their first argument fails. But resistance isn't a sign you need more force. It's a sign you're using the wrong approach entirely. The invisible weapon works differently. Instead of pushing against resistance, it dissolves resistance. Instead of demanding attention, it creates curiosity. Instead of trying to change minds, it creates conditions where minds change themselves. This isn't manipulation. This is collaboration with human nature rather than fighting against it. Here's what's fascinating about silent persuasion. It doesn't require you to be the smartest person in the room. It doesn't require natural charisma or perfect speaking skills. What it requires is patience, observation, and understanding of a few key principles about how people really make decisions. Because despite what we tell ourselves, human beings are not rational creatures who occasionally have emotions. We are emotional creatures who occasionally rationalize. Every decision, every belief, every change of mind starts with a feeling. Logic comes later, usually as justification for what we already want to believe. The master of silent persuasion understands this. They don't try to win logical arguments. They create the right emotional conditions and then let logic follow naturally. But here's where most people go wrong. They think emotional influence means being more emotional, more passionate, more excited, more intense. But intensity often creates resistance. When someone comes at you with high energy and obvious agenda, your defenses go up automatically. You start looking for reasons to disagree, flaws in their argument, ways to maintain your independence. Silent persuasion works in reverse. It creates calm where others create chaos. It offers space where others apply pressure. It suggests where others demand. And paradoxically, this restraint makes it more powerful, not less. Because when someone isn't trying to convince you of anything, when they seem perfectly content whether you agree or not, something strange happens. Your resistance drops. Your curiosity rises. You start leaning in instead of pulling back. This is the first principle of Machiavelli's invisible weapon. Influence flows toward those who need it least, and away from those who need it most. The person desperately trying to convince you reveals their weakness. But the person who seems indifferent to your opinion, who offers insights without attachment to whether you accept them, they become magnetic. Because their confidence suggests they know something you don't. But understanding the principle is just the beginning. The real power comes in application. In knowing how to create the right silences, ask the right questions, offer the right observations at precisely the right moments. In learning to recognize the invisible currents of influence that shape every conversation, every relationship, every decision. Over the next several minutes, we're going to break down exactly how this works. How to read the hidden signals that reveal what people really want. How to plant ideas that grow into convictions. How to become the person others naturally turn to for guidance, not because you demanded their attention, but because you earned their trust in ways they can't quite explain. Because once you understand how silent persuasion really works, you'll never see human interaction the same way again. You'll start noticing something unsettling about the people around you. The way they shift in their seats when certain names are mentioned. How conversations slow down when specific individuals enter the room. The subtle deference that appears without anyone explicitly asking for it. These aren't accidents. They're the result of invisible forces most people never learn to wield. Machiavelli understood that the most dangerous power is the kind you can't see coming. While everyone else was fighting visible battles, He was studying the invisible ones, the psychological territories where real influence is won and lost. Because here's the brutal truth about human nature. We like to believe we're independent thinkers, but we're constantly looking for cues about how to think, how to feel, how to behave. Most people give these cues accidentally. They leak their insecurities through their need for approval. They broadcast their desperation through over-explanation. They reveal their weakness through defensive reactions. But the masters of silent persuasion, they control these signals with surgical precision. They understand that every micro-expression, every pause, every choice of word is either building their influence or eroding it. Watch how this works in your own life. Think about the last meeting you attended, the last group conversation you were part of. Who did people look to when difficult questions arose? Who did they unconsciously mirror in their body language? Who seemed to set the emotional temperature of the room without saying much at all? I guarantee it wasn't the loudest person. It was the one who understood something the others didn't. The second principle of invisible influence is this: authority is not given, it's assumed. And assumption happens in the space between stimulus and response. When something unexpected occurs, there's a moment where everyone looks around to see how they should react. The person who fills that moment with calm certainty becomes the reference point for everyone else, not because they demanded it, but because they provided it. This is why panic spreads so quickly in crowds. One person's fear becomes contagious because others use it as a signal for how to interpret the situation. But it works in reverse too. One person's unshakable calm can steady an entire room. Their confidence becomes evidence that everything is under control, even when the situation is genuinely uncertain. The master of silent persuasion learns to become that steady point, not through false bravado or manufactured confidence, but through genuine emotional regulation. They train themselves to remain centered when others become reactive, to think clearly when others become confused, to hold space when others collapse inward. And this emotional stability becomes magnetic because stability is rare and valuable. But here's where it gets sophisticated. True influence isn't just about being calm in crisis. It's about shaping the very framework through which others interpret reality. This happens through something Machiavelli would have called contextual control. You don't argue with someone's conclusions. You subtly alter the context that leads to those conclusions. Let me show you how this works. Imagine someone believes they're not good enough for a promotion. The obvious approach is to argue with this belief directly, to list their accomplishments, point out their strengths, try to convince them they're wrong. But this creates resistance because you're attacking something they believe to be true about themselves. The invisible approach is different. Instead of challenging the belief, you change the context around it. You might ask questions that help them notice skills they hadn't considered. You might share observations about how others perceive their work. You might create situations where their competence becomes undeniable, even to them. You're not arguing with their self-concept. You're providing new data that makes their old self-concept impossible to maintain. This is contextual control in action. You're not forcing change. You're creating conditions where change becomes inevitable. The person still gets to feel like they discovered their own worth. They still get to own the realization. But you orchestrated the circumstances that made that realization possible. This principle applies everywhere. In negotiations, you don't argue for better terms. You create contexts where better terms become the obvious solution. In relationships, you don't demand respect. You behave in ways that make respect the natural response. In leadership, you don't command followers. You become someone worth following. The third principle is perhaps the most counterintuitive. The less you appear to want something, the more likely you are to get it. This isn't about playing games or being manipulative. It's about understanding a fundamental quirk of human psychology. We're naturally suspicious of people who want things from us. Their desire activates our defenses. but we're drawn to people who seem complete without us. This creates what Machiavelli would recognize as a paradox of attraction. The person who needs your approval least is the one whose approval you most want to earn. The individual who seems indifferent to your attention is the one who captures your attention most completely. The leader who appears unattached to power is the one people most want to follow. But this only works if the detachment is genuine. False indifference is easily detected and creates the opposite effect. True detachment comes from having something more important than the immediate outcome: a larger purpose, a deeper mission, a clearer vision of what really matters. When you operate from this foundation, individual interactions become less charged because they're not carrying the weight of your entire self-worth. This is why desperate people rarely get what they want. Their desperation communicates that they need the other person more than the other person needs them. This creates an immediate power imbalance. The desperate person has revealed their weakness, and the other person, consciously or unconsciously, will exploit that weakness. Silent persuasion operates in reverse. It communicates abundance rather than scarcity, strength rather than weakness, choice rather than desperation. This doesn't mean being cold or uncaring. It means caring about the right things in the right proportions. It means having enough inner resources that you don't need to extract validation from every interaction. When you operate from this foundation, something shifts in how others perceive you. They sense that you're not trying to get something from them, which makes them more open to what you have to offer. They feel safer around you because you're not emotionally dependent on their responses. They trust you more because your motives seem cleaner. This trust is the foundation of all lasting influence. Not trust that you'll do what they want, but trust that you'll do what you believe is right, regardless of the consequences. This kind of integrity is rare, and rarity creates value. People are drawn to those who seem to operate from internal principles rather than external pressures. But developing this kind of authentic detachment requires work. It means building a life that doesn't depend on any single person's approval. It means developing skills and resources that give you real options. It means cultivating inner practices that keep you centered regardless of external circumstances. It means becoming someone who genuinely doesn't need to manipulate others because you have everything you need within yourself. This is the ultimate expression of Machiavelli's invisible weapon. Not the ability to control others, but the ability to control yourself so completely that others naturally want to follow your lead. Because in a world full of people who are reactive, desperate, and emotionally unstable, the person who remains calm, centered, and genuinely indifferent to outcomes becomes a beacon of possibility. They start to wonder what you know that they don't. They begin to question their own reactions. They find themselves adjusting their behavior around you without understanding why. And this is where the invisible weapon reaches its full power. You're not just influencing individual decisions anymore. You're shaping the entire social ecosystem around you. But here's what separates the masters from the amateurs. True silent persuasion isn't about getting people to do what you want. It's about creating environments where the best outcomes emerge naturally. You're not pulling strings like a puppeteer. You're more like a gardener, creating conditions where the right things can grow. This requires a fundamental shift in how you think about influence. Instead of asking, "How can I get them to do this?" you start asking, "What conditions would make this the obvious choice?" Instead of pushing against resistance, you remove the sources of resistance. Instead of trying to convince, you create spaces for people to convince themselves. The most sophisticated practitioners of this art understand that influence is ultimately about serving something larger than yourself. When people sense that your agenda aligns with their genuine interests, when they feel that following your lead actually makes them better off, resistance dissolves. Not because you've manipulated them, but because you've created genuine alignment. This is why the most influential people often seem the least concerned with being influential. They're focused on something beyond themselves. A vision, a mission, a set of principles that transcends personal gain. This focus creates what others perceive as strength. And strength, real strength, doesn't need to announce itself. It simply is. As we reach the end of our exploration, consider this. You already possess everything you need to wield Machiavelli's invisible weapon: the capacity for stillness in chaos, the ability to observe before reacting, the wisdom to understand that the most powerful position is often the quiet one in the corner, watching, listening, understanding the currents that move everyone else. The question isn't whether you can learn these principles. The question is whether you'll have the patience to practice them. Because silent persuasion isn't a technique you apply. It's a way of being you develop. It requires you to become someone worthy of the influence you seek. Someone who doesn't need to demand respect because they embody it. Someone who doesn't need to argue for their ideas because they create conditions where those ideas become inevitable. In a world where everyone is shouting, the person who whispers commands the room. In a culture obsessed with immediate gratification, the one who can wait holds all the cards. In an environment where everyone is trying to be seen, the one who controls what others see becomes invisible yet undeniable. This is Machiavelli's gift to those wise enough to receive it. Not the crude manipulation of the desperate, but the elegant influence of those who understand that true power serves something greater than itself. The invisible weapon isn't about controlling others. It's about mastering yourself so completely that others naturally want to follow where you lead. And once you've glimpsed this possibility, once you've felt what it's like to move through the world with this kind of quiet authority, there's no going back. Because you'll have discovered something most people never realize exists: the space between the words, where all real influence lives.